What follows is a section from the keynote that I gave at the GANZ conference in Brisbane in September 2014. This is the second theory section where I'm trying to unpick the concept of Gestalt and states of grace. Prior to this, we'd been discussing the concept of presence with reference to the paper that I wrote about 10 years ago now called Will and Grace, an integrative dialectic for Gestalt psychotherapy, where I'd been describing the sense of two types of form in contact moments that come together to create our sense of self and experiential world. This notion of will and grace as an integrative dialectic was developed by Marianne Shidiak and I in our paper Process of Presence, wherein we described presence as energetic availability and fluid responsivity. So you can see the influence of will and grace in that definition. The theme of the conference was present at the edge, and my intention was to flesh out this concept that had been referred to by Mark McConville at the last GANZ conference, to look at how we evaluate and judge the quality of our moment-to-moment experience, but also our lives. And in this second theory section, I draw very heavily on the evaluative criteria that are referred to as the autonomous criteria in Pearls, Hefferline and Goodman, pages 231 to 232. So, here's the second theory section. Pearls, Hefferline and Goodman quote, and I quote, state, "The figure is specifically psychological. It has specific observable properties of brightness, clarity, unity, fascination, grace, vigour, release, etc., depending on context. This is of capital importance in psychotherapy, for it gives an autonomous criterion of the depth and reality of the experience." Later, they say, the achievement of a strong gestalt, or figure, is itself the cure. And the meaning of that to me is that our very capacity to have these vibrant figures or aesthetically good forms is our criteria as Gestalt practitioners for a good life or health. But I wanted to look at this in more detail, and the reason for doing that is I think there's something about this definition and focus on specific forms of aesthetics that leads us to practice in a way that I am going to characterise as more will-based or individualised, in spite of us saying that we are and always have been relational in our approach. So that's a provocative statement, and I want to explain or unpick a little more what I mean by that. Pearls, Hefferline and Goodman called their criteria the autonomous criteria. And of course that's an interesting word, autonomous, that I'd like us to look at a little more. Autonomous, which we might think of as more will-based perhaps, or more Pearlsian in some ways, is defined in the free online dictionary in the following ways. Firstly, not controlled by others or by outside forces, independent. A second definition, independent in mind or judgment, self-directed. I found 3 other definitions in other dictionaries. Independent of the laws of another state or government, self-governing, which of course we as Gestaltists like to be. Another offering is relating to a self-governing entity, or thirdly, self-governing with respect to local or internal affairs. And I found myself wondering if in practice that meant that our values, deep at the heart of our practices, Gestalt, psychotherapists, consultants, coaches, means that we still hold somewhere in our field an ethic that continues to be mostly about ourselves, our autonomous self, and the aesthetic or forms of our individual lives. And what I want us to consider here is what would have happened if, rather than focusing on autonomous criteria, we had instead focused on more gracious or a specific type of relational criteria for the forms that emerge at the contact boundary. And I'm defining relational here to mean contextually sensitive. You'll remember that Marianne Chidiac and I define presence as energetically available and fluidly responsive. And it's that dimension of being aware of context and responsive to context that I want to emphasize, not to suggest that we should become confluent with our situation in any way, but to emphasize that we are in no way independent from our situation when we are present. Indeed, the moment that we become autonomous or self-governing, I would say that in actual fact, rather than being fluidly responsive to our context and co-emerging with the field, we are instead impressing and imposing ourselves upon the field and attempting, most often not consciously, to bend the situation to our will, or perhaps acting as if the situation were what we wanted to be rather than what it actually is. And I say this not because I want to push a particular ideology at you, but because I believe that there is an aspect of the original Gestalt evaluation of health that somehow, in some places, got pushed at some times into the ground. And I want you to hear again what Pearls, Hefferline and Goodman wrote. They said, the figure is specifically psychological. It has specific observable properties of brightness, clarity, unity, fascination, grace, vigour and release, etc. depending on context. So we can now attend more fully to another aspect of the sentence, and that is the situational, the contextual. And we might say that here we start to make figure the context, rather than the autonomous aesthetic sense. And obviously both are important, but I can start to pay more attention to relational fit, to fluid responsiveness, and make this aspect of my presence figure. In my recent work, I've referred to this aspect of harmonious relational fit as grace, a fluid responsivity or surrender to what is. And I'm going to emphasize that word surrender as something that we do willingly, not a sacrifice of ourselves, but a giving of ourselves to the situation, a state of being harmonious with. And I recognise that for some this might be a spiritual dimension, for others it's a profound experience of connectivity, and we might think of it as an I-thou moment. I want to for a moment just do for grace, exactly what I did for autonomy, which is to look at some definitions of grace. And I found myself, as I did this, thinking very much of how Laura Pearls and Paul Goodman write about a particular form of relational Gestalt that's highly contextually and situationally dependent. And again, if I went back to the free online dictionary, grace is defined first up as seemingly effortless beauty or charm of movement, form or proportion. Secondly, a characteristic or quality pleasing for its charm or refinement. And thirdly, a sense of fitness or propriety. So certainly aesthetics and good form are here, but perhaps more harmonised with the situation rather than independent of the situation. There are other definitions and meanings of grace that I think are also particularly significant. So again, another dictionary definition is a disposition to be generous or helpful, to show goodwill. Mercy or clemency, or here's one I particularly like, a favour rendered by one who need not do so, an indulgence. So here we see a sense of ethics coming in to the definition, a sense of generosity and goodwill towards the other. And a final aspect of grace that we can find in dictionary definitions is a temporary immunity or exemption, a reprieve. And I like to refer to that as a sense of spaciousness. And I'll be talking much more about my work on the liminal space, where we develop spaces as places to step into and be mindful of, where we contain action and accompany ourselves, our clients, with a creative development of a range of possibilities rather than a move to action on any of those possibilities. So a real slowing down of pace. So I'm emphasising there 3 dimensions to grace, and I'm going to try and develop each of those dimensions a little more with you at the GANZ conference. But specifically, we're looking at dimension 1 being the aesthetic dimension, where we emphasise our harmonious and receptive fit with context. So that's a particular sort of relational ethic. There's a dimension that I'm going to talk about specifically as an ethical dimension, where we grant that favour that we need not have done so. So we extend ourselves. And the French philosopher Emmanuel Levinas talks of that as a curvature of intersubjective space, where we elevate the other. And third, the quality of spaciousness and slowing down, becoming very mindful of the present moment. And I'm going to develop that theme in the workshop on the liminal space. But for now, I want to incorporate those three dimensions into a particular form of a relational approach, and as particular aspects of relational criteria for evaluating our presence, the quality of our lives, and of present forms in the moment. And my contention is that these gracious ways of being and relational criteria lead us to be very concerned with our impact, and perhaps less absorbed in our intentions and plans. We have a slowing down and a focusing on what is. And I just want to play for a moment with what some of these relational criteria might be for good health. So here are just a number that I've created for us to discuss and debate. First up is, how well do we sense and resonate with our context, rather than our projections or plans? How fluidly do we respond to our context, and how empathic are we? And I'm drawing a lot here on work that we've carried out as a relational movement, when we've partnered with the Relational Centre and Relational Matters here in Australia, to really develop these themes of empathy and these capacities that as humans we carry with us at all times. We remember that we're far more connected than we are separate. We might want to consider what has been our impact on others and the planet, as well as ourselves, and to think about not just the peak moments in our lives, but also those moments where we've really joined with others in a state of compassion and what we might call an I-thou moment. Third thing I want us to consider is, how has our presence made a difference? What sort of a field and world have we helped to co-create and to co-emerge? And I'm thinking here of the inspiring work that's been carried out, particularly at the Relational Centre in Los Angeles, but also by other colleagues in the Gestalt world, Bob Lee, Gary Yontef, Lynn Jacobs, Gordon Wheeler, where we've heard arguments that without healthy fields, then really what we see as psychotherapists are the casualties of unhealthy environments. And perhaps rather than perpetuate that cycle, we really want to be sure that we've made a difference to creating a healthier planet where we can all flourish. And fourthly, I'm going to talk about that as, have we been faithful to the situation? And I mentioned earlier that I'd been in a study group where we had spent a year looking at evil, and indeed written a paper together called Philosophy with Tears. But one of the philosophers that inspired me at that moment was Alain Badiou, who wrote a book called An Essay on the Understanding of Evil, where he argues that for evil to occur, really all we need to do is just take ourselves away, distract ourselves or deflect from what is actually unfolding in the present moment, that he calls the event site. And finally, I want to emphasize and ask the question, have we sustained life and protected the future? And those are the two key criteria that Mark Fairfield points out in the relational movement as being absolutely prioritized for a particular sort of relational ethics, and that in relational change we pick up on in our relational charter. So I want you finally to come with me on a journey, and I'm going to call this an experiment in gracious Gestalt thinking, and we're going to just briefly evaluate our lives in two different ways. First, we're going to look at the aesthetics of so-called peak moments. Do an appreciative inquiry, if you like, of moments when we've been most fully alive, when those autonomous criteria have really been flowing and we've been in what we might call a flow state. And then secondly, I want us to flip that experiment and look at what different things might come to mind if we evaluate our lives by thinking about the impact that we've had in the world, and what sort of a world that we have been using our lives and our presence to co-emerge. And this second experiment I'm going to call the legacy. And I want us to think a little bit about what we privilege. Not that we should sacrifice either, but just to notice the difference in our feelings when we think about the aesthetics of our living, and secondly, the impact and legacy that we leave in our wake.